This is our first of the spring of 2 ICS Faculty Fellowship Lectures. I'm Jolie Sheffer, Director of the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society. Part of the mission of ICS is to engage the BGSU campus and surrounding communities in conversations about important issues in society today. Our events feature innovative lectures that help to transform the institutions that structure our lives. And so I'm very pleased to be able to have this event here in a community space to talk about gendered labor, performance, and in part, I suspect, like a post-COVID world and how COVID has shifted some of these labor practices. Before we go further, I want to stop to acknowledge that Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts toward decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who've been living and working on this land from time immemorial. The acknowledgments of land, labor, and ongoing systemic racism included here are one way to show respect to indigenous communities, but those signals are meaningless without action. So as we ask that as you navigate the world around you, and as you observe and participate and engage, that you yourself act to insist upon the correction of institutionalized racist practices in our communities. So we want you to be alert to stereotyping, the absence of representation from Black, Indigenous, and persons of color and queer communities and disabled communities, and inequities in education, housing, health, law, and commerce. On the subject of access, we do have copies of, like large print copies of the slide deck here tonight, so if anyone needs that, raise a hand and we can make sure you have those or get them afterwards. I'll make some other announcements, but please note that we do have those here on hand, and we will make available afterwards both video recording of the event and copies of the slides for folks who maybe couldn't be here tonight but would like access. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Angela Ahlgren, who is an ICS Faculty Fellow this semester. Angela teaches theater history and performance studies in the Department of Theater and Film at BGSU. She currently also serves as graduate coordinator for the MA and PhD programs in theater. Tonight's presentation examines the role of stage managers in live performing arts context using ethnographic methods of data collection. Dr. Ahlgren's project explores how stage managers engage in organizational, emotional, and aesthetic labor as they manage the relationships among public-facing performers, behind the scenes, directors, and the often invisible and mostly male backstage workers of the theater industry. And accordingly, I want us to recognize the often invisible labor of the people who have shared and prepared this space for us, those who will clean up after us after we leave, although we'll do our best to clean up after ourselves, and those who work to maintain it. So thank you very much to Heath Deal and the Black Swamp Players for letting us use their space tonight. And truly, in an era where social infrastructure seems to be ever smaller, it's spaces like this that really serve a local community that have a lot of power and impact. And so this is sort of the partnership here between the university and the Black Swamp Players, I think, is a great example of the kinds of collaborations we want to foster. I'd also like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences marketing team for their support to help us get the word out about the event. And I'd especially like to thank the ICS graduate assistants Joe Elia, Stanley Owasu, Iswat Junaid, who's here now, and Renee Ayala, and our intern, Andrew Burrows, for all the hard work they did prepping for this event weeks ago, as well as this evening, trying to get all the tech and everything working. Some addition, yes, thank you. And a couple final quick announcements. If you're a student who's here and would like to have confirmation of your attendance for extra credit, we have sign-in sheets at the door there. We also have flyers about our second ICS Faculty Fellow event, with Dr. Ryan Ebright. That's next week, so check that out. You may have seen that rotating around. And we also have some stickers and things about the Big Ideas podcast. Both, all of the current and former fellows will either have appeared on the podcast or will, and many other friendly faces I see in the room. So if you're not already following our podcast, would love to have you follow that link and keep up to date on those conversations. And if you're interested in being on our ICS mailing list to make sure you never miss the next announcement, you can email us at ics@bgsu.edu or follow one of our social media platforms and make sure that you see those announcements. And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome Angie Ahlgren.
All right. I haven't worn one of these for a long time. I used to wear one when I taught large lecture classes in Texas. Okay, well, it's really an honor to be here, and thank you all for coming on a super rainy night when I know it would be the easy thing to sit on your couch and enjoy the thunder from inside. So I really appreciate that. And I want to briefly echo some of the things that were already shared, but I want to thank Jolie Sheffer and the ICS interns, as well as, I think I have these here, as well as the ICS interns. I have two of their names here and just met Renee and Iswat just when I came in, so thank both of you. I also want to thank Heath Deal and the Black Swamp Theater, Black Swamp Players for hosting this. It is much nicer, I think, to be doing this talk in a theater space where it feels like, where it feels relevant. And also thank you to the Department of Theater and Film, my colleagues there who are, surely doing extra labor as I have been on faculty improvement leave and the ICS fellowship this year. So giving me the time to be able to work on this research is really appreciated. I also want to thank Dan Cullen and David Lair, who have been helping me with transcribing interviews, which itself is quite a feat of labor. And then finally, the stage managers who have taken the time to talk to me so far. Anybody who has given me names of people to talk to, I really appreciate that. And so I want to recognize the time that they took out of their lives and schedule to make this project possible as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start. So I'm going to do a little bit of reading to introduce the talk, and then I'm going to shift into sharing some sort of excerpts from interviews that I've conducted, and then kind of return to some thoughts afterwards. So, Places Please, Stage Managers, Gender, and Invisible Labor examines the role of stage managers in live performing arts contexts using ethnographic methods of data collection. Stage managers, like other backstage or crew workers, are essential to the operations of theater, dance, and other modes of live performance, yet they are rarely seen by audiences or studied by scholars. Once a male-dominated position, contemporary stage managers are most often women-identified at about 65 or 70%, and job duties are often articulated in highly gendered language. So in this talk, I bring two interdisciplinary fields, performance studies and labor studies, into conversation. I explore how stage managers engage in organizational, emotional, and aesthetic labor as they manage relations among public-facing performers, authority-wielding directors, and the often invisible and mostly male backstage workers of the theater industry. I want to use this talk as the basis for a journal article that explores stage managers' relations to the hierarchies and power dynamics of their working lives, including but not limited to gender roles, unions, and the range of workplace cultures in which they labor. I also want to note that this is a relatively new project, and so I say that because I really hope that this, in our Q&A, I'm really open to hearing your ideas and insights too about who I might talk to, or what kinds of questions will be useful to ask in future stages of the project as well. So this project takes inspiration from a number of sources, and the first of which is my own experience as a stage manager early in my career. My first solo stage management gig was for a production of Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest at Augsburg College when I was a junior. During this show and in the years that followed graduation, I took pride in readying the rehearsal space and stage for performers, in taking down blocking and giving actors line notes, and especially in running tech rehearsals and performances when the show started to feel like mine. Carrying my own props, a clipboard, a pencil, and a watch, and costumed in backstage blacks, I carried out my own studied choreography of checking presets, touching base with the front of house, calling places, and finally donning my headset and sitting down to my prompt book to call cues from the tech booth. I loved being part of the creative process, watching a show come together from the first awkward table read through scene work and on to opening night. Eventually, the pull of more regular hours and better pay prompted me to leave stage management behind. And now, as a faculty member in a department that houses theater, film, and dance, I'm aware of stage management labor from a different perspective, and I consider the kinds of things we in production departments teach stage managers, consciously or unconsciously. Even as students, stage managers shoulder a lot of responsibility. They work closely with the director and take a supervisory role with other students, all of which is valuable experience. But this can also work in more detrimental ways. At one former department, some of the stage managers' labor was abused to the degree that, despite being among the brightest students, their grades often slipped because they were constantly on their phones during class, managing cast members' schedules and covering for actors who missed costume fittings. And this covert and unpaid caretaking labor still weighs on my mind. So although I've been thinking about this project for many years now, we in theater find ourselves at a moment in which labor conditions for performers and technicians alike are receiving renewed attention. As theater workers returned from the pause the pandemic forced on its activities, theater workers on and off stage began to question the punishing norms built into the profession. As one New York Times article from August 2022 asks, can the theater find a way to uphold its workers more holistically as humans, even as they continue to gut themselves every night? Equity, or Actors Equity Association, the actors union to which stage managers also belong, has agreed to change some of the grueling schedules like 6-day work weeks and 12-hour days in future contracts. But these are small and still nascent changes that are unlikely to undo the deeply ingrained truisms of theater, like the show must go on, and that artists must suffer for their art. A 2020 essay in HowlRound, a free online newsletter on current theater topics, delves into more urgent political issues, encouraging stage managers to adopt anti-racist strategies in their work. A 2021 New York Times article spotlights the lack of racial diversity in stage management and points to recent grassroots efforts to redress it. And theater scholarship on those who work backstage is also a relatively new phenomenon. In her 2021 book, Working Backstage, theater historian Kristen Essen tells the story of backstage technicians' work, specifically in relation to New York's Local 1 chapter of IATC. Her book focuses on the ways that, despite the many divides between them, these backstage workers collaborate with onstage workers to create theater. By viewing backstage and onstage labor as essentially cooperative, she says, she can highlight their mutual professional goals, economic investments, and political interests. But unlike the backstage technicians Essen writes about, stage managers occupy a position that is betwixt and between backstage and onstage workers, and between capital L labor, or actors, and capital M management, or producers. Stage managers belong to the same union, but also have to uphold the rules of the contract. And they work some of the longest hours of any theater workers, and they do so nearly anonymously. So, writing and thinking about theater as work can at times seem counterintuitive. Those of you who labor to make theater know how much work it is, and yet a wide cultural view of theater and other art forms is to understand it as leisure, or play, or a passion that is its own reward. Beth Osborne and Chris Woodworth in their anthology, Working in the Wings, ask, how do we theorize the work of play when it has been intentionally or unintentionally hidden from view? Even performers who are visible to audiences while they do their work may not be perceived as working in the moment of their labor. Theater is predicated on illusion, on making difficult or even impossible things seem natural and easy. Osborne and Woodworth continue, for many, the theater is an escape from the drudgeries of daily toil. For the artists and craftsmen called to this field, theater making is not a distraction from labor, but is, in fact, legitimate labor in its own right. In other words, art is work. These studies and a handful of others bring discussions from labor studies into the field of theater and vice versa. And labor studies, broadly speaking, endeavors to understand the nature of work, the lives of workers, and the politics and organizations under which they labor. And at least in instances where theater and labor studies overlap, a lot of the emphasis is often placed on union histories or major labor movements or historical moments in which labor issues come to the fore, such as the Great Depression and the Federal Theater Project in theater history. My project departs from this pattern somewhat, although Actors' Equity inevitably shapes the work of stage managers, whether or not they belong to the union. I find that those workers outside New York or people who work for smaller companies, belonging to the union is peripheral to their lives in theater. And for the most part, for most stage managers, belonging to a union created for actors is an uneasy fit. Stage manager and historian Jennifer Lee Sears Shire explains that as the stage manager emerged as a job distinct from the director in the early 1900s, stage managers began to oversee the technical aspects of the show, but also performed as an actor, usually in a small part. Stage managers thus joined Actors' Equity because of their acting contracts, and this precedent remained in later decades as the stage manager emerged as a new role for actors in the union to take on when appropriate. At the time the role emerged, back in the early 1900s, stage managers were typically men. At present, stage managers is on the whole a field dominated by women, except of course in the most lucrative context, which is Broadway. Even so, the role is often described in highly feminized terms. One recent stage management manual states that a stage manager functions as a personal secretary to the production and as a confidant and shoulder to cry on for performers, listing qualities like compassion, poise, and discretion as essential to the role. Mary Ellen Allison's A Survival Guide for Stage Managers lists, in addition to more practical attributes like organization and leadership, the ability to empathize and the ability to mediate, to be someone's surrogate therapist, brother, sister, mother, referee, father, etc. Aside from a few of those latter ones, these descriptions mostly are socially scripted as feminine attributes. Moreover, Allison insists that as a stage manager you should, quote, keep your mouth shut and let the director do their job. Indeed, some of these points are echoed by the stage managers I interviewed, either as qualities they themselves value or as industry and gender norms that they want to push against. And later in the project, I will share some ways that stage managers see their work as gendered labor. So, when I started this project, I knew that I wanted it to be a mostly ethnographic project, that my focus was going to be on really understanding the lives of stage managers in detail. So I set out to interview people of any gender who work or have worked as a stage manager. It was not necessarily important to me that they right now be working as a stage manager, because I also want to know why people leave, right? The interviews I conducted are anywhere between 60 and 120 minutes. One actually went a little longer than that, but about 90-minute interviews. And I chose to do structured interviews. I asked the same questions of everybody. You know, one reason, of course, is so that I get a sense of the variety of responses that people would have. But at the same time, I wanted these questions to be open enough so that my participants could narrate to a pretty large degree their own experience, and so I could get a sense of how they think about and describe their work. I use the snowball method, which means that most of the people I started with are people I know personally or are in my network. And then from there, I ask people to recommend other people so that I sort of get a rolling ball that gets larger and larger. About half of the people I've interviewed so far are working in Minneapolis. Others work in Dallas, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and a few of them, although have worked in New York on Broadway, but are not working there right now. And right now, all of these interviews have been conducted over Zoom. While I kind of imagined that I might go places in an old-fashioned way and sit with people and interview them, the sort of ease of interviewing people over Zoom, it just became the preference for everybody. So my pool of participants is pretty small still. It's 9 people that I've actually completed interviews with, but I have a long list of people that I want to interview. But it's also been very rich in insights. And so my early findings tell me that stage managers are deeply invested, not just in their roles, but in the collective labor of performance making. They think a lot about their work, both how to build and navigate their careers, and how to do so thoughtfully and ethically. They value the artistic communities of which they are a part. They have put a lot of time, effort, and creativity into their jobs and have gotten a lot of it back. And at the same time, they labor under difficult conditions. They work long hours and they shoulder a lot of responsibility. Some of them want to quit. I hope that this research will make at least an indirect contribution to clarifying the contours of their lives and the value of their labor. So some of the goals of this project are for me to better understand stage management labor, even though I did it for a couple of years after college. It's been a long time, and I had a very sort of limited scope of experience. And I want to also understand the gender dimensions of theater labor, not just around stage management, but what all of the hierarchies, how those hierarchies affect stage managers. I also hope that in talking about some of these issues that we can disrupt some of the more harmful theater norms and mythologies about needing to suffer, needing to, this sort of the show must go on mentality that, while very important in certain contexts, can be harmful on a human level in a lot of ways as well. And then finally, to be able to collaborate with stage managers to lobby for the kinds of changes that they think would be useful in the industries and companies that they're working for. So, what the stage manager does. Just a little bit of context I have up here. There's an article from 1919 in the New York Times. The role has evolved over the last 100 years, but there are things that have not changed. I quote here from this article called What the Stage Manager Does. The stage manager, despite the extent of his duties and responsibilities, is a figure in the theater who is practically unsung. He must not be confused with the stage director, who directs rehearsals and is finished with the production once it is running smoothly. The work of the stage manager is a labor of infinite detail. It begins with the calling of the company for the first rehearsal, and it continues so long as the play continues, and even afterward. Much depends on it, but for all this, the stage manager is not a high-salaried man. Generally, he receives little more than the actor playing a small part. 40 years later, Ruth Mitchell was gaining attention in New York for her work as one of the only women stage managers on Broadway. An undated press release, likely from the mid-1960s, provides a thorough listing of the work Mitchell did, which sounds very much like what contemporary stage managers do: managing scripts, taping floors, calling cues, wrangling actors, and even treating minor injuries. She also famously kept a list of the best doctors and bars in the cities her productions toured to. She is quoted as saying that once a show opens, no matter what mistakes are made, I feel personally responsible. This feeling of personal responsibility for carrying a show forward is also a common thread in the interviews with contemporary stage managers I've conducted. So I need to also say that Ruth Mitchell, I spent 2 weeks researching her in New York in the fall, and she's really fascinating. She's not really part of this talk, but you can ask me about her if you want to know more in the Q&A. So I want now to just turn to some of the interviews, and I'm going to do a little bit of my best to kind of embody some of the tonalities of the particular stage managers that I interviewed. And first I want to talk a little bit about how they perform organizational and aesthetic labor. So I asked stage managers how they would describe their work, and Lindsay G., who is now in Dallas but has worked on Broadway, says that stage managers are the hub of the wheel. You're trying to make sure that the show has whatever it needs to get up and then do whatever its version of 8 shows a week forever. She doesn't see herself as working for a specific person, a director, etc. And when she was younger, first she said that she needed to tamp down her Texas accent so people would take her more seriously. But she also had to get comfortable, quote, pushing back against directors or producers and saying, I don't work for you, I work for the show. This big, conceptual thing. Joyce D., who is in Las Vegas currently, says you have to be a chameleon, right? Like, I've been super lucky that I'm a natural kind of empathetic person, so I've always had the ability to read a room. So, I really do see the stage manager as a unifying force. I've encountered stage managers who are, for lack of a better term, power hungry. It is ultimately detrimental. And Victoria R., who is starting her career in stage management in Washington, D.C., says, being a stage manager is being a professional problem solver. You're kind of there to recognize a quote-unquote problem. It's just like, being the glue. It's the thing that holds everything together and catches the stuff that, nobody thought of and that kind of stuff. I think a big part of being a stage manager is being team show. I'm not on anybody's team except for the shows, so if you're messing up the show, then we got a problem. Phoenix in Phoenix says, so a lot of people liken stage management to like a project management role, which is it's not wrong. I think of it a little bit more as a process management role because so much of it is just about being a guiding and facilitating force for the process of creating theater. And Elizabeth in Minneapolis says, in a nod to her mentor, the late director Marion McClinton, whose approach to directing was to get out of the way of the story, Elizabeth sees herself as a stage manager of the story. Are we getting in the way of the story? And if we're getting in the way of the story, then how do we get ourselves out of that and get back to the story? Because the last thing we want to have happen in the audience gets smarter than us, right? I mean, we should really be the ones holding all the cards. And so how do we keep that? How do I keep that train? How do I keep the beats moving and the movement happening so that we are telling the story that needs to be told? What I hope is clear from some of these excerpts is that stage management is more than the sum of the person's duties. It's more than taking down blocking and writing rehearsal reports, though those are things that stage managers do. But they are undertaking organizational or management labor. But stage managers also understand their work as aesthetic labor as well, collaborating with other artists to create an artistic experience. Elizabeth McNally, one of the people I quoted here, recently won a prestigious McKnight Foundation Resident Artist Award for her work as a stage manager, which is significant for her, of course, in her career, but it's also the first time that this foundation has recognized stage management as an art in its own right. I asked people, what are the benefits and drawbacks of doing invisible labor in theater? And Victoria said, I think being invisible to the audience is awesome. I think it's a fabulous thing to be, and it's what makes it so fun. It's like you're sneaky and you get to, be the magician in the back, and everything about that is great. I think the fact that that statement of if you're doing your job while you're invisible permeates itself into rehearsal and tech is crap. I can't stand it really. If you are in theater and you don't know what a stage manager does, or at least what your stage manager does, you're bad at stuff. You're not paying attention, and you're not appreciating the work, and you're not appreciating the people that you work with, because if you weren't paying attention to the stage manager, you aren't paying attention to a whole lot of stuff. Lindsay says on the challenges, well, a stage manager is never going to sell a ticket, right? And if that's how you argue your worth to whoever is negotiating your contract, right, of I'm bringing more financial value, so therefore you need to pay me more money. Stage managers, for the most part, don't get extraordinary risk payments. You know, it's not like there are specialties added onto what they're doing. I think there is some extent where a producer would be like, if you're not going to take it for minimum, I can find somebody else who will. And there's nothing you are bringing that somebody else couldn't do also. Somebody else can call the show. Somebody else can, check the prop table sort of thing. And Elizabeth says, it's an invisible art. I think stage management is a lot like directing, right? Where people can't necessarily see what you do, but they certainly know when you've not done it right. Nobody knows when I'm really good at stuff, because they're going to give the reason why I'm really good, they're going to give it to the actor. They're going to give it to the designer. That moment was awesome because the design was amazing and was this big spectacle. Well, how do you expect it all happens every night, timed perfectly? I don't get that credit from people. Invisibility is more than a matter of not wanting to be in the literal spotlight. Most of the people that I interviewed don't want to be noticed. But in an industry where fame and name recognition is a kind of currency, stage managers can lose out, especially in contexts like Broadway, right? Where how much people get paid is how much people want to come to see them. So they don't always have the kind of negotiating power when they decide to take jobs, at least in certain contexts. I guess I can talk about this quotation now. I have this quotation here about emotional labor. This is from Arlie Hochschild, who is an ethnographer who wrote a pretty well-known book about flight attendants in the 1980s. And she talked about the ways that they are, as many of you probably know, they're required to be pleasant and keep the flying experience very smooth and happy. So she says about emotional labor, this labor requires one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others. In this case, the sense of being cared for in a convivial and safe place. This kind of labor calls for a coordination of mind and feeling, and it sometimes draws on a source of self that we honor as deep and integral to our individuality. So Victoria says, this is where I'm kind of getting these two concepts together between gender and emotional labor. She says, everybody likes a lady who has a lot of good ideas but doesn't need to be in charge. And that isn't necessarily a good thing, but it does work in our favor. I think that for me as a woman, personality management is built in. It's, oh my gosh, a man with an ego, what do I do with that? Please, that's absolutely part of everyday life and in all aspects of my life, right? That's not just that I learned that at work. I learned that in my house with my brother. It's just how it is. Kenji, who is a cisgendered man, says, sometimes there is an emotional labor put onto stage management that is complicated. He talks about while sometimes that labor is okay and necessary, there are other times when stage managers are relied on as a therapist or a mental health expert for which they are not trained. And he attributes this fact to that stage managers have historically been seen as performing a caretaking role, and then that caretaking labor is also connected to gender expectations. Lisa frames her stage management style very much in gendered terms. She says that rather than be a power-hungry stage manager, which she associates with men, she describes her style as motherly. She says rather than use conflict or confrontation as strategies for getting people to do what she wants, she leverages guilt and disappointment. She never yells at people if they're late. She just expresses concern and asks what she can do to help next time. This gentleness and subtle emotional manipulation she associates with a more feminine style of stage management. And at the same time, she talks about how producers or theater administrators can take advantage of gender, especially with young stage managers, by working the power dynamics. She says they realize what it means for especially young women to want to be part of a particular company and then lowball them when it comes to compensation, often with the rejoinder that they're part of a family. We are not a family, she says. She has also encountered hostility from backstage workers. During one show in which an all-female stage management team needed to work with an all-male union backstage crew, the women encountered resistance. Of one man in particular, she says, I would speak to him and he would talk to someone else to tell me something. Like truly a grown-ass man in his 60s who wouldn't regard me as a human being. She laughed as she related this story, but she also noted on a more somber level that she regrets not reporting the behavior, though both of her fellow stage managers did. And this was again something she kind of attributes to being a young stage manager and not wanting to have to resort to reporting someone. So stage managers encounter a range of behaviors from others and from themselves that they connect to gender expectations and gender hierarchies. And much of the labor here also falls into the category of emotional labor, making sure that the people in the room are feeling a particular way. Okay, oops, I'm gonna come back to this. So a couple of things, I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19. It's inevitable, I think, for anyone doing research right now. Everyone attempting reality for tired theater laborers. At the time of our interview in the fall, Lisa was weighing whether to continue stage managing or to go full-time at her part-time job managing a garden center. I can't fix this industry, she says. There's not time in my lifetime to make this better. Kenji also acknowledges that when he talks to other stage managers, the conversation turns to compensation and inhumanely long hours. Nearly all of the people I have talked to so far hope that they can disrupt some of the age-old paradigms about stage managers' roles in the process of making performance, but in the meantime, it remains difficult. Elizabeth says, I think a lot of us are struggling, and it's, the work-life balance. Like Lindsay describes finding herself in the position of advocating for Black performers with textured hair to access better materials from wig artists in New York City. These types of low-key advocacy for people who are not in positions of power align with what Narda Ahlgren and Lisa Porter name as strategies for anti-racism in the rehearsal room, through which stage managers can act as allies. The stage managers I've spoken to are thoroughly engaging, thoughtful, creative people who want to make things better for themselves and those coming up after them. They love working in theater and being part of the collaborative process of crafting performance. It is clear that there are deeply entrenched beliefs and practices that are beginning to shift, but change is slow. Stage managers have a unique position of being a conduit, a funnel, or a hub for the production. They probably know more about what happens on a particular show than almost anyone else. As that contact point, though, they also accrue responsibilities. As I illustrated above, some stage managers are taking on the labor of allyship and advocacy. Others are using intimacy coordination training to improve the rehearsal process. Many of the people I talk to discuss being the person who sets the tone for a rehearsal, and so this advocacy labor is crucial for the culture of rehearsals to change. But it is also on some level a kind of caretaking labor of the type that often falls to women and is often uncompensated. Questions remain then about how theater companies, schools, and particular productions will support the types of advocacy that needs to be done, while also compensating the labor that stage managers invest in making it happen. So I want to just close briefly by presenting this list for some small changes. These don't come from me, they come from the people that I interviewed when I asked them what changes would they hope for in stage management. Of course, these answers were much broader than this, but nearly everybody talked about the ways that the unrelenting schedule is difficult, and so changing the culture so that stage managers have understudies, particularly following the pandemic where there needs to be plans for if someone cannot make it. Having an on-call list of stage managers so that in some kind of emergency or moment when a stage manager needs a day off for whatever reason, there is a kind of list of people who can fill in. Changing the whole idea of the stage manager as the first to arrive and the last to leave. In many ways, it's kind of an arbitrary thing. It's a thing that when I started stage managing, it was like, well, makes you feel really important, right? You're the first to get there and you're the last to leave, and you sort of seal that whole experience up, but that is not necessarily sustainable for everybody. And finally, and this is really more of a union thing, stage managers don't get paid for production meetings, and they also don't get paid for the time that they spend doing paperwork after rehearsals. And this is a thing that they spend a lot of time on and should be paid for. So these are just some small things that will probably take a lot of work to work toward, but there are some things that, at least some concrete steps toward change for stage managers. So thank you. I'll end there and we can go on to questions.
I have t-shirts for people who ask questions.
Yes, Ryan.
Thanks for your talk, Angie. Super fascinating. Thank you. One of my, I don't need one of my questions is about the gendered language that's used to describe the stage management positions. You talked about how job descriptions often use this gendered language. Is that something that that has been fairly consistent throughout the 20th century, or do you know of a point at which we really see this shift toward gendered language, particularly as the demographic makeup of the profession
Yeah,
changes?
it's such a good question, and I don't necessarily know when that shift might have taken place, and I imagine it's been sort of a short journey, really, from 1919, stage managers being assumed to be men, into the middle of the century where women start doing it more, and then to a kind of moment where it is mostly women. And so I'm not exactly sure when that changed. The place where that language comes up is mostly in manuals, like manuals and textbooks for theater. So, and a lot of them are a little outdated because they're ones that have been sort of around for decades and then just get sort of additions and they're updated. To the point where, and Kelly can probably affirm this, that a lot of stage managers who are students now are aware of they have the critical thinking skills to understand that they're reading some sort of gendered language, or that they don't necessarily want to replicate this idea. But there tends to be a kind of framing of the stage manager and director in almost marital terms sometimes, right? Like you're sort of
almost.
Yeah, yeah. You're sort of the playing a more servant role to the kind of artistic genius, which is almost always framed as men. And there's a lot of interesting, I sort of asked people too, why do they think stage management is such a woman dominated field? And people have a lot of really interesting ideas. I don't yet know the historical answer, yeah.
Are you coming up with any similarities in attitude and answers based on how and when they were trained? Because it is that connection to the early stage management texts that are highly technical based, that this is what you do and this is how you do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get into I think Larry Fazio's book is the moment that we turned around and became very emotionally charged. We became the person who created the room.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was that first moment. It's I would be really curious as to where each of these stage managers that you interview are on that timeline.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I feel like my sample is so small, but I do have people who range from people in their 20s to people in their 50s. And I think that I think for the women that I interviewed who are in their 50s working and have worked on Broadway or in kind of big commercial theater contexts, it's not that there's not an awareness. I think there's almost more of just like, well, here's the things you have to do to be successful in this business. Whereas I think a lot of the younger people so far that I've stage managed have it just goes a lot, it makes so much sense with how people are trained even outside of stage management to have this sort of more awareness of a variety of identities and how those impact their work. But I definitely I'm curious to see if, as I expand the number of interviews, how those things start tracking. Yeah. Yeah, Heidi.
I'm really interested in this idea of also kind of the invisibility of stage managers within Actors Equity Union, which is also stage managers union, which you mentioned. And I also, I'm a little sheepish here because I did not realize stage managers don't get paid for production meetings and paperwork. So, and that seems to me like a very union-driven thing. And so I'm just wondering, especially post-COVID, what are the changes in landscape in terms of that invisibility within the union?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know in the broader sense, like I don't know yet if there, that if there are stage manager specific rules that are changing outside of the broader, like the 10 out of 12s, thing and 6-day work weeks. But my sense from people that I talk to, and almost everyone I've talked to so far is a member of the union. For some of them, if they're working on Broadway, it matters to them in a bigger way. It's just like an assumed thing, like you're in and then everything, like there's why would you bother doing anything that's not equity? Whereas in somewhere like Minneapolis, it's not assumed that you need to do that to get a lot of work. And some of the Minneapolis folks too were like, well, the union, yeah, like you have to follow the union rule book for when people have breaks and all of these other things, but they're also like, I can't go to the equity office and make copies. It's in New York. There's sort of some practical resources that just don't really make sense for that landscape. So you don't really get the full benefit of the union. I don't remember where I was going with this, what your question was. But I guess, I think that there is a sense that things need to change. I just don't, it feels like a longer slog. Yeah.
No, I just think that's really, because, coming in with expectations about talking about invisible labor, like within the theater structure, within performance, within productions, but I had not really thought about it within the union.
Yeah, there's just parts of, and I guess it's sort of familiar. It's like they're faculty or teachers, right? Like there's all this labor that is not acknowledged that goes on. Yeah.
Well, just to add what Heidi said, a lot of the pure union stage managers in New York, yeah, they're not paid for a lot of the invisible stuff. If you get embedded in a company, you can negotiate that. Because almost all of the equity stage managers at the big Shakespeare festivals all summer long, they are paid for that, but it's because they're paid as a company member. So that's how a lot of stage managers will sort of raise their hand and say, I need to be paid for this. The one thing that is in almost everybody's contract now is 2 weeks pre-production, as opposed to 1. That used to be, 10 years ago, it was you had to get your rehearsal hall taped out. You had to do all of your paperwork prior to the first rehearsal in 1 week. And it's almost impossible. So now they're at 2 weeks pre-production, which is awesome. And the ongoing conversation of 10 out of 12s is, it's huge. I don't think there's a stage manager in the country that's not talking about it right now.
Are any of the folks you're talking to yet involved in a touring production? Because I ask because I have a friend who does that,
And I wonder how the conditions are different, where like you're following the show, but it's, you know, every few days you're moving to a different city, and how that affects this.
Yeah, there's one person, I don't know if there's anyone that I've talked to that's like right now doing tours, but there's two people who have had that experience, and like there's two of them basically have the experience of, which is really like a Broadway or touring thing, just being on a show as long as the show is happening, or you get a better job, you know, and so that does seem to be a very different mindset than, you know, and other people are like, oh, I'm so glad I only am on a project for 6 weeks. I would never want to be, you know what I mean? There's just, it kind of, yeah, but I do imagine that it's one of the weird things about this job is that it looks so different depending on the context in which you're working. Like there are, Elizabeth, the one who won the McKnight Foundation Award, you know, she works for a company called Pillsbury House Theater in Minneapolis, which is a small theater. It's a small black box theater. They really only do work by artists of color. It's in a very historically black neighborhood, and she herself is a white woman, but they, you know, I think she is in a place where I don't know what she gets paid, I don't know any of that stuff, but she is in a place that fulfills her artistically and kind of politically, which seems so different from like the younger people who are trying to do gig after gig to just like kind of build their reputation, to the people who are like, you know, some of the folks are kind of not really on shows anymore, but are really production managers. They mostly are like office workers for theater shows. So yeah, so there's just like a really wide variety of what this work looks like, where it happens. That is, you know, at a certain point for this project is I'm going to need to figure out what slice of that is going to really be where what I pursue, because it's too big of a project.
I guess part of what
yeah.
I'm thinking about too is that like there's a way in which that gendered labor, also thinking of it as sort of domestic labor, like if
Yeah.
you are tied to a specific theater space, I'm curious what role the sort of domestic caretaking plays versus, okay, you know, the show's in the trucks, we on to the next theater, the spacing is different, if that relationship changes.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there's a relationship between that touring with also company managers, which is sort of stage management, but not, and that, you know, I think that also becomes a kind of administrative caretaking kind of thing, so.
In your looking at stage managers, have you asked what their support team looks like? I mean, are we looking at 1 or 2 assistant stage managers, sometimes up to 4? Did you get to ask that?
Yeah, it
I'm
really.
sure that would have some impact on how much that one stage manager, you know, feels put upon by all of the things.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, where it's like, it really, most of the people that I interviewed don't have that, you know, they, like, some of them are just like, it's just them, you know, it's just them, they're working, that's kind of how it was when I was doing it. It's like, it's such a small theater, they could barely pay me, you know, and then that is more, but you're also not dealing in those situations, you would be in a space that is this size, you know, not like a gigantic theater with lots of, you know, I don't know, technical needs necessarily. So yeah, there is a difference, and I think there, you know, but again, it's like, in this moment I'm kind of exploring, I feel like the sort of exploring what there is to explore almost.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because the question about, you know, the way to potentially have a stage manager understudy,
Mm-hmm.
I think they're sort of exploring that on a lot of Broadway tours right now.
Yeah.
Because not everybody, like, there's a rotating call. The
Mhm.
stage manager won't necessarily call the show every night, so that if they go down,
There's-
somebody else knows what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is so much easier to do if you have a whole team,
Mhm.
as opposed to if you're the only person, or you're the person and then there's one run crew person who's never, you know, seen the whole show all the way through. then yeah, it's really different. So I think it's really, like, the people who are suggesting those understudy things are more in like Minneapolis, DC, like the places where there's like a tight theater community, but it's not this like big apparatus, the same, you know.
Corporate.
Yeah. Matt, I thought I saw your hand going up.
There's a lot to unpack here with this. As a former stage manager for 14 years, working in opera in Europe and here in the States, being a former equity member, I just want to poke a couple of these points real quick, and
Yeah.
you can bear with me. As an equity member, it was a 6-day work week, but on Monday, I got to work all day to catch up, or I'll be let go, right?
Yeah.
So it's really 7 days a week, and your downtime is rehearsal, because that's when you're able to enjoy what you're making.
Yeah.
So there's some things to have to come to terms with there. And as far as a tour, the day off is typically your travel day. That's not a day off.
Right.
Because you're in a bus and in a bunk and you're not able to do anything. After the show ends, you have to farm yourself out again to try to get that next job, right? That next show. So, with all those points in mind, what did you hear about burnout?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, we should sit down and interview so that I can hear some more about your work.
You don't want it.
But yeah, burnout was a total theme, you
Yeah.
know, and I expect it to continue to be on all levels, because, although I have to say, there was one person who was just like, is itching to get back. You know, she's kind of like, I'm stuck over here because the pandemic ruined the momentum, and I'm, you know, she's like, wants to get back in it. But I think, yeah, burnout was a thing where either people wanted to move up into like more production management or management roles that are not so on the ground to help with that, or, you know, like the person that I talked to who was just like, I want to quit, I don't want to do this anymore, you know, because even after the pandemic, I think she came back to work with a theater company and was really trying to sit down and be like, let's make some plans. What if I get sick? What if someone, you know, and the theater company was just like kind of brushing her aside. So I think there's sort of, the burnout seems to come more when it's like, no one else, like, you know, that you feel like you're the only person saying the thing
Right.
and no one's listening. Yeah, but definitely a theme. And I think probably in most labor, so many labor sectors right now. Yeah. Yes, Samson.
Yes, I think this is a wonderful presentation, and I would say that as a PhD student, it seems like a nice, concise, and complete presentation in a sense. Like, you know, I write a lot of 20-page, 10-page papers. You brought in your own experience, you brought in theories, articles, you brought in the interviews you made, and you also give small changes or suggestions at the end. So it seems like a complete set. So my question to you would be, in addition to bringing in more interviews, more voices, and asking them these questions, what are those other things you do to really broaden your paper? And what stage are you right now, and what stage are you planning to move on to continue to like bring it out into a full book without necessarily just saying that you would add more people or something like that?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot. Like this, I think that with these sort of, this set of interviews, I want to be able to write a journal article that introduces some of the ideas that I've got here, that some of the insights that, and to be honest, I could only fit so few of there's so many more interesting things that people said. So for right now, this is a journal article, but I think that I still don't really quite know what happens next, because, and part of it is because I think, like I was saying before, it could become so expansive as to be bigger than a book, and if that were if I suddenly was like, I want to do a whole oral history project on stage managers across the United States or beyond, that would require kind of a level of funding and infrastructure and labor itself to just manage that, because it is pretty labor intensive to conduct interviews, but then also to transcribe them and really listen to them and process all of that. And so there's two things I'm thinking about. One is that I don't know if it will be a book or if it will be a collection of essays that just kind of come out as the research happens. Or it may be that I would seek out some collaborators along the way, like co-authors, to kind of work on different aspects of this with me, because I don't also feel like I need to be the voice of stage management in the field. So one of the things I'm kind of thinking about is like, well, how might I be able to collaborate with people who are working as stage managers or who did, to kind of look at different aspects. Yeah, I mean, and then in terms of just like, what would I want to do? I really want to go and like find a couple, maybe for some of the people I've already interviewed, I would really like to be able to just shadow some people for a while, hang out for a week with people in the theater, and like, I kind of know what happens because I've been a theater person, but it's also been such a long time, and I think that would also help me kind of get myself, I think you learn a lot by doing that kind of thing, yeah.
I was just going to say really quickly, I think that sounds really interesting also in terms of changing conversations within the landscape of theater practice. You talked about the one stage manager who is incorporating a lot of intimacy coordination into his work, and that is a relatively new conversation in the field. So yeah, I think, and then also the conversation about how to implement anti-racist practices into the process, I think. Yeah. So not a question, just to say that sounds really exciting.
Yeah, this is just an observation, but I'm not sure. I just wanted to make sure that I'm not going crazy in my own head. So when you were reading the voices of the state managers you interviewed, when you were reading their transcript, was it just me, or sometimes you assumed, you read it in different, I took a class with I took a class on queer theory, and there was this video we saw with E. Patrick Johnson, when he was reading the oral interviews he'd done, and he kind of assumed the characters of those people he interviewed. Did you make any effort to do that, or is just me thinking it?
I did do that a little bit, and I wish if I had more time I would like do it a little. I don't want to go full like Anna Devere Smith on you, but like but I feel like I want, and I really would have liked to also like share audio, but I don't have that IRB permission, so I just couldn't do it for this right now. But I do just like to get the sort of attitude, like, because they're so delightful to me that I want to be able to convey some of that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're not, yeah. Oh, behind Kelly and then Kelly.
So just going off what Samson said, I completely agree. I think all this work is incredibly important. And with that, my question was, how would you recommend students, specifically undergraduates, articulate these methods to their theater departments who might already be valuing them?
So how would undergraduate students like talk to faculty about their own work as stage managers?
Yeah, basically, so like if there was an undergraduate student who came and saw this presentation today, but they weren't a BGSU student, and they go back to the department, are there any recommendations you have when approaching this work on how to make sure that it is, at the end of the day, equitable and inclusive?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I want to take some more time to think about that, but I think my first instinct might be to approach faculty with the idea that, I'm here as a student first and need to make sure that my coursework is a priority, and how can we, are there some small ways that we can work on the rehearsal schedule so that I can prioritize that at moments where I have things. Yeah, I wish I had a really better answer for you with that, but I want to think about it, and then of course as a department we can think about those things too.
Go ahead.
I'm still kind of mulling over some of the responses that you got to the first question you presented when you asked them about how would you describe, what a stage manager does. And it seemed as though, I think at least 3 of the responses had some sort of comment to the effect of like, I serve art, or I serve the show with a capital A, which strikes me as like, it's a pretty like intangible thing that seems like it'd be really susceptible to like job creep, where like where it's just like the responsibilities in that scenario are potentially limitless, right? And so I'm wondering about that sort of attitude of like art with capital A and being sort of like serving art, and how that connects to invisible, if you see a connection between that mentality and invisible labor. Yeah. I'm not quite sure how to frame the question, but just you have thoughts about that sort of mentality of like, I serve art.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, because I think that I have a slightly different read on it, but I don't know that I have quite evidence for my reading, which is I interpreted it a little bit as maybe a way to deflect being in a certain place in a hierarchy.
Okay.
So in a way to be able to say, I'm not your, like with a director, right? To not be like, I'm not your gopher, I'm not the coffee person, I'm an artist who cares about this.
Right.
Yeah, but again, like, I think that's an interesting also question about, are you replacing one kind of hierarchy with another? But I think my read of it, especially because the people who were expressing that were women who were thinking about themselves as like, they're younger in their careers, being able to assert themselves in that way. Yeah. Sarah, I don't know if you had a...
Yeah, okay, so I'm primarily a director, and I explicitly teach my students that I'm not at the top of the hierarchy, the show is. And that I'm serving the show and the potential audience. And for me, the reason I do that is to take ego out and to make it less about, like, it isn't about me having great ideas and you running around and doing what I say. It's about us working together to tell a great story. And I have always felt that has served me and served my students and my teams, but I also am really hearing what you're saying about, like, can that kind of attitude drive people to more work in a way, because you're kind of like, we all bow down to art. And I can see where that could happen. I can say that's not how I intend it or use it, and I try to use it as a way to actually set limits and boundaries.
Yeah.
But I can also see where it could do the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I was gonna say I'm really happy with where you are and where you seem to be going, because I think that a lot of stage managers that I've worked with and know and trained are gonna feel seen with your words, and that's really important, because I think that for me, the I serve the show is a certain protection. It's a self-protective sort of situation where it is, I do these things, and these things are very rote at sometimes, so that I can remove myself from having to be the mental, emotional, physical, draining job that sometimes a stage management job can be.
Yeah.
It sort of sets that definition of, this is as far as I will go. And we see that in faculty as well. This is as far as I will go. I will help you, but I cannot always sit and cry with you.
Right. Right.
Sometimes I
Yeah.
can, but sometimes I can't because I might not have that room. And I also have a real definitive job to do. And so I think that where you're going is awesome. And people will feel as though you have grasped the breadth of what is going on and the choices sometimes that are made as an individual, not always made by the company and forced on the stage manager. Sometimes it's just the way they approach that work.
Yeah.
But they
Yeah.
need to know that they can walk away from that if they need to for their own sensibilities.
Yeah. Well, thank you,
I think it's
Kelly.
really
That-
good.
That means a lot to me. Cool. Thank you.